Good morning, Your Holiness. Today we're going to spend the morning on the science, and then in the afternoon, John Dunn will take over as moderator, and we'll shift to looking at ethics. But of course, ethical issues pervade everything we've been discussing. This morning, we're going to look at something else that is behind everything we're discussing. And that is that this meeting could have been called Ecology, Ethics, and the Economy. And the reason is this, that whenever a forest is cut up into roads for logging, whenever energy comes from a plant that uses coal and makes greenhouse gases, someone is making money. It's the profit motive that's driving the vast majority of the destruction of the world. And you could say, well, maybe this is greed and ignorance, but there's something else. It's not intended necessarily. It's a consequence of another dilemma of the Anthropocene age. And that is that everything that manufacturers do, the chemicals they use and so on, were invented in a time before we could measure their ecological impacts. So people didn't know. One of the consequences of that is that we need to reinvent everything. We need to do things differently. So the question is, what could be the engine that drives that change to finding alternative ways of making things, of transporting them, the things we need for our lives? And this morning we're going to look at one system that may help very much in doing that. There's a saying in business, what gets measured gets managed. If you don't measure it, then you don't know. You can't tell if you're making a difference. And there's a new field, it's called industrial ecology. It's emerged within the last decade or two. It's people in the hard sciences, physics, biology, chemistry, environmental science, working with people in industry, industrial engineers, the people who design factories, who decide how we're going to make things, working together to analyze the actual ecological impacts of something like this glass. Through the lens of industrial ecology, this is not a glass. This is not a product. It's a process. That process began when sand was extracted, chemicals were manufactured or taken from the earth and so on, transported to a factory, combined, heated at 2,000 degrees for 24 hours and so on, then transported to a store, and now we have it as a glass. Someday this glass will break, it'll be discarded, it has an end of life. In other words, every object has a life history, just like a person. And if we look through this careful lens at the life history of anything made, we now have a way to measure and manage what before we couldn't grasp. So just to give you a sense of the kinds of things that are measured, one of the obvious ones is greenhouse gases, carbon. Now in the UK, if you buy a bag of chips, it will tell you what its carbon footprint is. And one of the things this does is help you decide. So this gives people who are buying things a way to tell which is better. Otherwise, you just don't know. Another measure is called a partially diminished fraction of an ecosystem. That means when this was made, what was the damage done to ecosystems? This is amazing, really, if you think about it, that we can now know this about these products. Another is comes from public health. It's called a disability-adjusted life year. That means, for example, if there's a poisonous chemical used in manufacture, and people who work in the factory or in that neighborhood are exposed to that chemical, maybe they'll get cancer. How many years of life do those people lose to disability, to disease, because of this product? So this is a lens that all of a sudden takes what Diana and Jonathan were talking about yesterday and brings it to us, brings it home in a way where we can have information we can use to make better decisions about the things we buy. However, that's not sufficient. We've been talking about implicitly about individual decisions and will throughout, but we need to also look at business decisions. The reason is this. In the States, many communities have very good recycling programs for plastics. Here it's harder to find the facilities, but if you have yogurt in the morning, it comes in a plastic container. And if you're very ecologically minded, then you send that to a recycling center. But if you look at the total carbon cost of that yogurt over its entire life cycle, when you recycle, you make up only 5% of the carbon footprint. 95% is in other places. It's in farms, dairy farms, as we heard. Methane and so on is a big problem for greenhouse gases. So the individual can only do so much. We need to look at the entire system of industry and commerce. And many products today in the West, I don't know about here in India, are sold as green, meaning this is ecologically superior. We're going to learn today that green is a mirage. The reason green is a... For example, I bought a green T-shirt. They call it green because it's made from organic cotton. That's very good. You don't have any chemical fertilizer. Nitrogen, we saw, was the biggest dimension of the Earth systems that are in trouble. So you avoid that problem, but it's more complicated. Organic cotton needs more water, and the fibers are shorter. You need more cotton to make one T-shirt. Cotton is unfortunately grown in areas of the world that have very little water. The Caspian Sea is now a pond because of cotton plantations. So that's a downside. It was a blue It was a blue T-shirt, which means it was dyed. Well, many of the chemicals used to make our cloth are poisonous. They're toxic.
I'm wondering.
I don't think you're robes, but we should look. So the question you want to ask is, did the dye house that made this T-shirt blue take the poison out of the water before it released it back into the river? Because if it didn't do that, and many don't, then the people who use that water get those poisons. And those poisons cause disease.
Yes.
One of the problems with industrial chemicals, there are tens of thousands of chemicals used in making everything. Very few of them have been studied for how poisonous they are, for toxicity. It's now been discovered that if you take samples from anyone in the world, we have what's called a body burden. A body burden is the chemicals we've absorbed in the natural course of breathing, of eating, and so on. And we all carry these toxic chemicals. And there's a theory now coming out of Harvard Medical School that the buildup of these toxic chemicals causes what's called inflammatory syndrome. You know, when you get a cut, the skin naturally gets red and a bump. That's a healthy inflammation. It helps the body to heal. But this inflammatory syndrome means that many organs in our body are in an inflamed state. And because they're in an inflamed state...
근데 지금 내가 예배 갑이야. 그 수부수야. 다 지단에 케미컬 담아다 막 보여주고 수부 내가 막 자세 망부지. 두신 땅증이 chen. 내가 좀 대대비 소리지. 근데 이게 다 수주어서.
Because they're in an inflamed state, we're more likely to get diabetes, heart disease, cancer, the whole range It makes us more susceptible. Susan, Richie's wife, was telling me that she's seeing in her practice more babies with a very bad birth defect who live on farms. And the theory is that there's a new kind of, what would you call it, a fertilizer? Or it's a herbicide. They put on crops, particularly crops that are genetically modified. This kills everything, but exposure to that particular class of herbicides seems to cause this birth defect. So in other words, there's a lot of suffering as a side effect of standard practice in business. And until now, those costs, you could say, have not been seen as a responsibility of the company. They were borne by the families who have someone sick or so on. But that seems about to change. There was just an article in the Harvard Business Review this month, the most prestigious business journal, about sustainable business, they call it. Sustainable business means you take into account your own company's responsibility. And they say, now that is becoming good business. It's becoming good business for several reasons. One is something that Diana mentioned, ecosystem valuation. We now have a way to measure the value of an intact ecosystem. For example, the World Bank has calculated that all of the just from insects that live within an ecosystem pollinating plants, that has a value for business of $200 billion per year. So if
now that
정부.
the 바주 the medosa being the church the rangshin 샤샤 직보기 빌린 이제 지금 송부터는 계산한 거예요. So can you explain that concept? How do you calculate that?
how do you calculate ecosystem?
No, this 200 billion.
Oh, okay. If you didn't have bees and you had to do that some other way, what would it cost you?
그래.
하나님께서 말해봐.
하나님께서 말해. 나는 pollination 되게지르샤. 그래서
진짜 가요.
that agriculture the 개들랑 주랑 신기다 코네밥 줘봐. that 맵이나 체도니네 디.
번 루리를 되게지 아이나.
So
연구 되게지 아이나.
so so this applies only to flower plants.
To mainly agricultural products,
but not to grains.
Or rice. I don't think.
Some crops yes, some crops no.
Vegetable, yes.
Fruits.
Oh, fruit, yes.
Yeah. But that's just one example.
Right.
But if you look at everything in nature and how we benefit, they estimate the total value at $44 trillion. 2/3 of that is in poor countries. So that's actually a resource that has great value in poor countries. So that's one fact. The other is that more and more investment money is going to companies that are more sustainable. So that's another trend helping. And the third is what we're going to hear about this morning. It's ecological transparency. This is becoming public knowledge so that shoppers can know. There's one website called goodguide.com in the States. You take your iPhone and you swipe it on, they have what's called a barcode at the bottom of a product, and it pulls up the entire range of ecological impacts of that product and compares it instantly to the competitor. So you can see, oh, this is the worst. I should get the best. So that's one thing, but also within business, the same thing is going on, and that's where our speaker this morning comes in. We can identify processes, ways of making glass. Maybe they don't use so much energy. Maybe they use better chemicals and so on. In what's called the supply chain. Supply chain means this guy buys sand from here, puts it in his truck, takes it there, and then they make the glass and then they send it on and so on. So at every point in that, we can tell which is better, which is worse. And this is new information. And that could drive what's called a continuous upgrade, meaning that there's now an economic pressure to do things in a more sustainable way. And this also makes a makes it very profitable to come up with better ways of doing things. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with styrofoam. Styrofoam is...
jalapatso packing chebe galleria kabu chik yugudo tanti madabyo tundalya plastic soro kabu soft chebe takbuchi
알로.
어디 데스 거 나.
Yep. And that styrofoam is made from oil, like plastic, and oil never dies. It never goes back to nature. So it's better to now use styrofoam, which is made from rice hulls, the part of the rice that you put aside when you process it, and the roots of mushrooms. They have a way of making styrofoam from these two things that are completely natural. So hopefully that's the future. So our speaker today, Gregory Norris, is an industrial ecologist. He taught industrial ecology at MIT and now teaches that at Harvard, University of Arkansas. He has a foundation which has developed a system to help companies understand the the environmental costs of everything they make, and which supplier is better and which is worse. And also to identify what factory, for example, uses child labor or has terrible working conditions, so they can avoid it. It has a humanitarian element too. So I'm happy to introduce Gregory Norris.
Well, Your Holiness, let me just begin by saying I'm filled with joy and gratitude for this dialogue with you. And I hope that our exchange brings benefits to our planet. Your Holiness began, in fact, yesterday morning by teaching us that when we want to look at an ecological problem, we need to start with science that asks, what is the situation? And the second step is to begin to look at the causes of the problems and the consequences. And we had Diana doing a nice job of explaining the alarming status of the situation. And Jonathan, who began to look at the consequences. Both speakers also helped us understand the direct causes of these global environmental changes, which I would summarize here as a combination of emissions, releases to air, water, and land of pollution from human activity, and also extraction or other impacts on natural resources. So taking water from the ground, taking minerals from the earth, changing the landscape, changing a forest to a field. So those are the direct causes of this global environmental change. What I'll try to do this morning is share with you the science and the art that we're using, as Dan says, to try and understand the indirect causes of those. So what is it specifically in human activity that's causing these emissions and these extractions, which then are causing the global change? We can refer to the emissions and the extractions, so the direct causes of global change, that are caused by an activity that we perform as individuals or as organizations. We can refer to all of those impacts as it's the footprint, sort of the footprint of the activity. And we can use these methods to understand our own personal footprint. We can also use this information to help us guide reductions. That's really the goal, or those are the goals. So for this morning, what I'd like to share is first, how do we practice this art and science of footprinting? and Your Holiness, I call it an art and science because we build models with data and scientific principles, but we can't observe and test exactly the results. So there's an art to this.
그래서 메시지 저당.
말을 지단 자리 지금 내가 구조 모델스 앤 experiment 스타트 되게 되면 다 제거로 봐. 다다 theory 뭐서 중요하단 제와 이번에서 인도가리아 간다 체제 안 다제 제가 모델스 컴퓨터 나올이야. 안 장가 잡제 다다 되게 되면 다야르지마도 디 theory 앤 experiment 나올 진짜 다 저거 서베나 간다 이것도 디다예요 말보다 체리 지단도 단다. 그러면다야 체리 따져 답람 창마 체리 짱짱한 자기가 말했다. 14병원에 셰베나 델레안직 아트 게데스 질레거서 그런 데르샤 단예도 배주제 돼. 리베트
그거에 내지 남주직 돈에 떠야리야 아트 코스.
Maybe a way to explain that, in the case of the science which Diana shared, we can build a climate model, and then we can test its prediction. We can measure the actual temperature change and see if the model was accurate. When we calculate a footprint, we can't. A footprint is an idea in a way. We can't go out and measure exactly the footprint. It's maybe that'll become more clear this morning.
간다 저한테 단예 되게 해주셔서 근데 치수도 배주 쉽지도 고유단 저의 강제에서 수주 자주 지그 돈에 고유를 휴겐 대비 강제 가르스라 다고 저 바로 제모도 지마시 창만 제제 두 말했어.
So after I share the how we do footprinting, I'll then share 7 lessons which I've learned from doing this work over the past 20 years almost. And finally, a response that I'm having to the messages of footprints. Now, when we practice life cycle assessment, and life cycle assessment, as Dan explained, is the methodology we use to calculate these footprints. We're focusing on a large subset of human activity. We're focusing on production of products, producing products, distribution, which is bringing them from factories to buyers, using and disposing of the products. That's an important subset of human activity, but it's also important for us to remember it's only a subset of human activity, and I'll come back to that at the end. The life cycle of a product includes the whole chain of production, distribution, use, and end of life. And so if we want to know the impacts, and by the way, I'll use a very specific example here today, a cell phone, which most people can relate to. And I just downloaded information from the web about how Apple makes a cell phone, and I use that information to build an analysis of the impacts, the footprint of a cell phone. So for the whole life cycle, we want to estimate all of these emissions and all of these extractions. But that means we need to know that information for each of those steps in the diagram, each part of the life cycle. And to do that, we have to break each one of those down into little steps. So for each step, we're collecting data on 4 things: emissions and extractions, but also the product output from that step, and the purchased inputs needed to produce it. Dan mentioned making the glass, so we needed energy, we needed sand, chemicals. For a cell phone, we need a battery, we need some glass, we need some plastic and metal, and most importantly, we need integrated circuits, which are like the brain in the cell phone. And it turns out those are very light, but they're by far the biggest impact of making the cell phone. So that's how we do it, and I actually have a model of the cell phone available. If Your Holiness would like, we can explore what does it tell us after the tea break. But I thought with our limited time this morning, I would first.
나 저는 나를 깨우다.
His Holiness,
Ignorance,
that,
complete ignorance.
when it comes to mobile technology, he says he's completely ignorant. He's not practicing any of this. There's no experience.
Okay, so your footprint doesn't include the cell phone. I can't claim the same. But doing this footprinting teaches us some interesting things about how we have impacts. That almost looks like a mandala, but it's actually a portrait of the supply chain of making a product, such as a cell phone. Each one of those little dots is a step somewhere in the world, somewhere in the economy that's making something used by the next. So the cell phone manufacturing is right in the middle, and all of the supplies, here are all the pieces to make the cell phone, and then this might be the integrated circuit. So to make the integrated circuit, we need all of these pieces and energy and transportation to make this, let's say this is gold. We actually need gold to help make the components of the integrated circuit. So here's gold mining, and here's manufacturing equipment and energy to mine the gold. It's that whole chain. You can really see ripple effects from buying a cell phone out across the world and the economy. So one lesson that I learned is when you buy from one sector, when anybody purchases from one sector, you're really touching most of the whole economy. You're buying from many sectors. If I buy a cell phone, I'm actually buying a little bit of gold, for example. So that's one lesson. Another lesson is when we buy from one country, we're really touching many countries on Earth. Here I used a database that studies the linkages between countries in production, and I asked which countries have workers participating in the supply chain, the life cycle of making electronics that are assembled in Mexico. And the color is red if you have the most worker hours, the most worker activity. So most of the worker activity is happening in Mexico, assembling the cell phone or the electronics, but also providing inputs to that activity. But you'll notice that China is pretty dark, of course, over here with lots of activity. And what's really striking to me is more than half of the countries on Earth are being touched by my decision to buy electronics from Mexico. So when we buy from one country, we're really buying from the world or much of it. A third lesson is, actually we don't need that slide. So a third lesson is, because of those first two facts, when we buy one product, we're really touching the planet in many different ways. We're influencing climate change, we're influencing water use, we're influencing toxic chemicals, we're influencing land use. We're really, one product has at least a small impact on every environmental issue that you could think of. So you really touch the whole planet, the body of the planet with each purchase.
메시지 차야 돼. 가래. 집 레버지는 무엇이나 스타일로.
Narim.
그 간데.
His Holiness is wondering why is this particularly
당연히 다시 인터페어를 시도하는
Narim.
게 저디야.
Narim law.
내 저디 인터페어를
Yeah, it's sort of an interruption, but His Holiness is curious, why is Mexico the center of this activity? It just happened to be for this, because cheap
right,
labors are
cheap labor.
everywhere.
Okay,
China and India also.
that's right. In fact, let me explain.
And the Asian technology highly developed 개발.
So it's also, Mexico is not known for its technological kind of superiority either.
So what is the reason?
So what I did, Mexico is a place where many electronic products, some electronic products purchased in the U.S. are actually assembled in Mexico. So
Maybe
I just
because
chose,
of close the neighbor.
That's right.
Proximity.
Maybe.
and so I chose Mexico as an example.
Oh,
But you could use the same database to
example 말이 마부터 지금.
나래 말단데 들다 단데
들어.
모바일 때 다가 애플 기 모바일 때. 데 모바일 신다다 만 보여. 단데 애플 기 배전 치라고 찔리 계시고. So your example here is very specific to the
That's
iPhone. Risha.
or to one product.
iPhone 글라 뜨네.
That's not personal relation. That mangujar. Yes.
In fact, if we choose a cell phone from a different country,
Yes.
we'll get a different picture
Yes.
and choose a different product.
Right.
But we can use this method to understand which countries do we touch with every.
배전 좀. 뒤에는 애플 기 모바일 믹세지 제. 뒤에 어른한 요요 없지. 근데 치다지 들려는 거는 하고.
Not clear.
True of almost any electronic we buy, no matter which one, they'll all sort of spread around. The components and so on are made around the world generally.
That's the
Just
supply
about-
chain is that, John, that's right.
Yeah.
And even Matthew asked me, I didn't have time to prepare a picture of a paper as an example, but even something as simple as paper made in one country will have a portrait
Yes.
that touches the world. It's true for, this is just one example because we're thinking about cell phones this morning. So, and these are worker hours, so that brings me my fourth lesson. When we purchase one product, we're touching millions of people on Earth. Every day we're touching millions of people with our purchases. And this database helps us understand how well are they paid? How long are they working? Are they forced to work too long and so on? So we can actually have a social footprint beside our environmental footprint. Now, the fifth lesson is that not everything matters the same. I mean that we can use this information to prioritize our actions. This is sometimes a controversial example, but I think it's a good wake-up for people. Many friends that I have, and most people in this room probably worry often about plastic bags that we get from shopping. And we think that's a really bad problem. And it can be a bad problem for things like litter, plastic ending up in the environment. If we think about climate change, one flight from, say, the US to here will lead to, actually from US to here and back, will lead to the amount of climate change impact of manufacturing 1 million plastic bags. That's one flight and 1 million plastic bags. So we can use life cycle assessment to help us focus on the activities that matter most and find the changes in our lives that will bring the biggest benefits.
Could I clarify one thing? Although that's true for greenhouse gas, the most important thing for plastic bags isn't greenhouse gas. It's the fact that they never biodegrade. They never go back to nature. So it's the end of life that's the most important priority for plastics.
That's right.
And for the airline, for flying, it's the greenhouse gas.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now we can actually look at the litter or the waste that's happening in a flight here and back. And I suspect that that's a good thing to look at with life cycle assessment is how much plastic waste is being caused in the supply chain of flying over and back again.
아니, 랑베이지 말봐. 돌랑게지 말봐.
일단 돌랑당당 원에 environmental effect impact 제베나 다 남도 도에 두고 요랬다. 단 다단 찍은 건 때문에 플라스틱 되게도 막 두르데 중얼 바 랑신 바 유르토에 자는 메디고 디잖아야고 너버 침부죠레스. 촉 다단도.
There are two more lessons that I'd like to share this morning. One I could call the smile. It's a happy lesson. And the last lesson we could call the tear. It's not a happy.
아무 사실 없는 짓인 거다.
Sometimes you also cry when you're very happy.
That's true. That's true. So maybe we can get happy, in fact, by the tear in the end. That's where we're headed. So the smile of this interdependence that we see is that when one business makes a strong innovation, they use their human creativity to make their product less impactful, that actually makes everybody's footprint smaller. And two examples I can give briefly. Caterpillar, which makes bulldozers, they recently redesigned their bulldozers to be much less energy consuming and polluting. That changed everybody here, our footprint, because there are bulldozers involved in building roads and mining coal, and we all use electricity, so we're all touching coal mines. So Caterpillar helped our footprints get smaller with that. Hewlett-Packard and other companies which make printers make them more efficient. We print on both sides of the paper now. That means that all of us use less trees in a year. So one smart choice by a company somewhere helps us all reduce our footprint through interdependence. But here's the tear, the sad tear, I guess. At the end of teaching life cycle assessment, I will ask my students, now that you've learned all of this and you've studied these data, you know that everything we do every day has a footprint. How many students feel that the planet would be better off if you had never been born?
맞이네.
나를 대체 고용은 되는스. 고용을 캡산데 수수마진에 야여를 삼삼 삼고한데 코니 수도 스케지 TV 갈라스. And then
they all say they feel that the planet would be better without them. And it's
플라넷 걸면이 약시로. 플라넷 걸면이 약시로.
so also that means that also the problem will be resolved if the planet is not there to begin with.
빅 뱅 만지부터 상관은 만지부터.
So it's all finally all the causes can be traced up to the Big Bang.
So it's not their fault. But I think what they're expressing here is that they feel a sense of guilt that every day they're causing pollution. And this is not something, as Your Holiness said yesterday, we don't do this on purpose. But we know that we're doing it. I think we hide it, but now with life cycle assessment, it becomes very clear to us that we're having this impact. And I'm really, when I learned this and when I saw my students learn this, I asked, how can we make this not true? How can we make it that, in fact, the planet is better? How can we reduce suffering, bring happiness to all beings? If we're doing these footprints, footprints are only part of the story. We have feet, but we also have hands, which we create. We have imagination. We change things. And so we could actually introduce the idea of handprints to quantify the positive impacts of our creative activity. And in fact, if our handprints, if the benefits of our creativity this year are bigger than our footprint, then we're healing the earth.
그래서 라베슈.
나를 다 고유부터는 수수 자체 가다가 집에 강제 샤딩으로 고유를 내배. 다디 동랭 소리지리야. 라베 수수를 왜 젠도 상단이 아주 고유 송접해야 돼. 돌이야. 라제샤야 답람면아. 디도네 강제 기디 가는
And we can create these handprints by making changes in our own lives, setting the heat a little cooler at night, or driving less, or perhaps using telephone and video conference sometimes instead of flying, and many choices. We can also influence our friends.
리팅상 손도 망부지 명모스 좀 고치제
네,
텔레비전
네,
비디오 링 제제
네.
다 남도 둬야 돼
레용루로.
용적으로 되지 답이 망부요 그래서
나야 인디비주 슈다.
so His Holiness would like to interrupt again.
According to, those the experts say a few thousand years ago, the whole planet population less than billion. Their lifestyle, mainly farming, and something like self-sufficient.
Self-sufficient.
So at that time, how much effect ecology?
We know this in
Industrialized 모중공을.
Is there any way of assessing the environmental impact of human activity before the industrial age?
Yes, we have those data Diana showed, and in fact, there's a framework, an equation that she mentioned briefly, which I have some slides.
I just felt like Tibet, huge plateau, right? Nomads, many nomads. 저ዛ 가서 the 보조 둘다 앉아서 건조된 거로다.
So yesterday we had a reference to methane gas release from the cattle. So in Tibet we have a lot of nomads, but they have cattle like yaks, and who too releases the methane gas.
So even you see their lifestyle very simple, but some extent this is some effect of ecology. Already there or not?
Yeah, they still have an effect. Yes, they have an effect, but it's a very small footprint. Even though they have the cattle, that's just a little impact. So the footprints in Tibet, I believe, are very small.
Thousands of times smaller.
So that did show any human being existence. Birds, wild animals. You see, their lifestyle also makes some effect on ecology or not?
Yes, but again, very small footprints.
That's right,
Like,
that's
like
right, that's
bird,
right.
like little bird footprints.
That's right, yes. 자상가다 지금 life exists 제법 코레 답이 ecology용으로도 가.
So this raises the question that the very fact of a living being's presence has an impact on the environment.
Right.
So 다음에 되게 보고서야 다르셔다. 맨 걸 약실이셔니.
So then those students who expressed that sentiment at the end of your question seems to be quite true on the
It may be
mark.
true for the
Anyway,
yak and
in
the,
any case, very existence itself
Right.
is causing some problems.
absolutely.
So now there's no other choice. You see, minimize the effect. Meantime, we mainly human being and other animal, other sort of sentient beings also, we still live more peaceful, more happier.
Yes.
That's the only choice.
I feel the same way, that we minimize our impacts, but they will always be there. And then we maximize the benefits we bring so that the net result is beneficial. Now,
가서 룰이야. 가서 싱싸움 먹고 떠올 삼아배, 그봐? 싱망으로칭이 어렸어. 뒤치도 그러다.
So Matthew was mentioning this tree plantation program in Bhutan, which has increased the number of trees there. So things like that could be done.
exactly.
Although very limited, but otherwise you see the many monasteries in the Himalayan range.
Himalayan
you see
range.
there are some program each year plantation. So of course very small scale.
I think it's helpful to think back at the science we saw yesterday and remember all these graphs which were very stable for thousands of years, and now they're going way up. So while there's always been true that every animal is having an impact on other life, we see the story that suddenly on Earth these impacts are out of control. And that's why I think it's important to use this framework to find out where are the major impacts happening, and let's get those down and let's make sure we balance them with some tree planting, as Your Holiness says, or other beneficial acts. And we can do this equation, this accounting for people, individuals. I could do it for myself. We could do it for communities, organizations. We can also do it for events. And I've done some calculations to see what is the footprint of this wonderful meeting this week. So, and I saw no nervous laughter in the room.
일단은 네 손도 저베 갱기
어디요?
고유리아
소소소.
느낌 중배 강제 다시 제베나스.
So we have the blessing of being together this week, and this can bring benefits, we really hope. But first, let's look at the footprint. We have roughly 100 people who have flown here. We're staying in nice hotels while we're here, and I used this method and these data to calculate our footprint, and it's roughly 400 tons of greenhouse gases released to the atmosphere, which is
Dharamsala 좋아도 비교다. Dharamsala 슈디기.
그래서
Dharamsala 슈디 좋아도 비교이제.
so also you have you will have stomach problems as a result of drinking Dharamsala water.
Usually
That needs to be factored in.
okay. Okay, that's life cycle thinking. I left that out, but we can change it. There's always more to include in a life cycle assessment model. So
그래서 거다 갈아 봤을 때.
장가제 되고 내가 같이 차산 쭉쭉 말았어요.
So maybe a little more than 400. But also water, etc. So now we can ask ourselves, how can the benefits of this workshop to the planet be larger than this footprint that we have? Diego and the Mind and Life Institute have said that they're committed to planting enough trees, if necessary, to more than offset our carbon footprint. But there's another way we can address this, and that would be if each one of us looks for actions that we can take in our own lives as a result of the things we learn here, and calculate the benefits and add them up. For example, some of us, especially after we hear from Matthew, might consider eating less meat. We can set our thermostats back, we can drive a little bit less, and so on. We can make changes in our own lives, and we can encourage our friends to make changes, and they can encourage their friends in the ripple effects.
Yes. That's the way. That's the only way. True.
So that's really, with that message and with that image of kind of understanding our own impacts and committing to being net beneficial, that concludes the remarks that I wanted to share with Your Holiness this morning.
One just, of course, I have no sort of, because the knowledge is detailed things. But you see, I think more than 15, 20 years ago, once I was in Stockholm, some of my friends, they told me in the river in Stockholm city, some time back, no fish, all gone because of the too much pollution in the water. And then later, the begin appears some fish. So they told me the industries along those sort of river, not sort of banned, not because of the stop, but still going on. But they arrange special sort of arrangement,
environmental measures.
or reduce, you see, the pollution or that thing. So without damaging economy thing, maybe a little expensive.
Exactly.
But otherwise, it's still going on, this sort of industry, but less effect on
the river.
river. Then one occasion in Germany, then at that time, West German and East German. So now I can't remember which place. One occasion in West Germany, actually, you see, the organizer, you see, they brought me to tour one factory. They told me their factory, you see, to pay much attention about environment issue. So that from that I got the idea, without sort of big change or stop these things, but still there is possibility, you see, to create industry or these things much less
Negative impact. With negative impact,
Oh,
much less
negative
negative
impact.
impact.
So I don't know. The German economy now today much better among the Eurozone countries. So they seems to be quite healthy. So here in Germany,
Then the Helga German.
oh, I see. So, so I'm just curiosity. What is their secret? I don't. Right.
What is the secret of these kind of successes?
You
So
know,
if there's something, you must share with other people.
that's right.
So in any way, I think that's anyway it's a model.
It's a model. Serves as a model.
Right.
The economic condition also is very good, but at the same time, the country, generally speaking, I think ecology, I think is still better.
But,
Of course, the climate condition also makes some differences. Like Poland or these, because of the Baltic states, very green, like that. I don't know.
It's true.
Then another negative side, I think 2 years ago, I met some Tibetan, very near Lhasa. They showed me one picture, one factory. They told me, since that factory built, actually that's the thing, because of the empty valley, no human being, but there are a lot of wild animals. Then they say, after building that sort of factory, a lot of wild animals that area died. So it is very clear, because of that, without proper sort of
Planning.
Plan,
Narem.
the immense sort of
Impact.
Very true. Thank you. That's all.
On that note, it's time for our tea break. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Of this session, and over the break, some people have been asking Professor Norris about more detail on this information. How can we use it, or how could a company use this? And I wondered if you could talk about the costs and the benefits a little bit more.
Is it loud enough? Your speaker?
Should I say the whole
Say
thing?
it again, yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Repeat.
Okay, thank you, Your
Yes.
Holiness.
Oh.
The data that you get from a life cycle assessment is pretty overwhelming. And I wondered if you could go into more specifics about just how overwhelming it is, and then simplify it for us, and tell us how we can use that, or how it could be used for the benefit side of the equation.
So, Your Holiness, Dan, you're right. It's life cycle assessment is sort of an interesting enterprise where we have to look at the details. Every product is different, and we have to go into the details to learn the message from the study of one particular product,
What are
and
those
I'll do
details?
that for,
What are those
for a
details?
cell phone.
But let's get
But
it
what
up
I'm
on the screen and also the monitor for His Holiness.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So what I've done, good, and I know the guy who runs the screen can follow along here. We'll wait for him to load it up.
You need to put it on full screen and it comes up.
Oh, how does it...
Put it on clone.
Thanks, Diego. What I've done is take this information for a cell phone, since that's a product that, as I say, many of us can relate to, and linked it to databases on how are the components to electronics made. And these are databases which have thousands of different steps in the supply chain studied for us. Thank you. And here's, Dan said, how could companies use this? It's really how are companies using it, because thousands of companies are using these methods already to study their impacts, to figure out what matters, and to reduce it. And here, let's pretend we're working for Apple Computer now, and we just modeled our iPhone. The first sheet that we have here, actually this is going to be tough, Diego. Somehow it got a little bit too small. Yeah, I can do some things, but I can't go to... It's a web browser. Yeah.
Hit
Well,
Control plus.
What does that do?
It'll make it bigger.
I want to go back, smaller.
Control minus.
Okay,
Apple
so-
minus. Apple
Yeah,
minus.
let's try that. There we go, that'll work. So the first thing that we learn here is we see that there are different impacts. Remember, every product is impacting on climate and human health and ecosystems and water, etc. So we have the different impacts lined up. And here I've chosen ecosystem impacts first. So making a cell phone, what's causing ecosystem impacts? What's causing the loss of biodiversity through land use, the loss of biodiversity through toxics released to air, water, and land? The answer to us here is very clear. It's that light, small brain in the cell phone that accounts for, looks like about 80% of the impact. It's a small fraction of the weight, but it's, if they can find ways, we'll look in a moment, why is the integrated circuit causing ecosystem impacts? But we see that those are the brain of the cell phone, the integrated circuit, are the two big drivers. Next is the battery. And in fact, if we just find ways to make those less harmful, we'll have made a very friendly, environmentally friendly iPhone. But what about climate change? If I click on the, I'm not sure why it's not working.
I don't think it's working.
Yeah. Can we shrink it?
라르다 디릭 대문진체 디릭의 소답 진다제 돈에 소야 답시는 너버 충당제 주되는 디톤
Since we don't have internet, so we're really...
창문라고 창도 말데 지 코유고 돈 내긴 최쇼 가와도 됐다 코요
Let's see if we can get the map.
The map would be better.
For this tool to work, it needs to be connected to the internet. We've loaded data, but
Just go ahead then.
let me just tell the story. I've looked at this already, and I'll say that the big driver of the ecosystem, and now it's listening, impacts is actually gold mining in countries like Papua New Guinea and Chile. So if we were interested in why is it, what are the climate change impacts, it's because making, again, these integrated circuits, these brain in the cell phone, are highly energy intensive. They're also the processes that consume the most water. So companies use this to, in a number of ways. First, they prioritize, and every product is different, so you have to study your own product. Next, they actually ask the suppliers, that's the companies that they buy these important things from, to do their own calculations of their own impacts. And they're starting to ask those suppliers to reduce. They'll look for example, mines that are much less impactful, or they'll find substitutes. But maybe a good example would be
Go ahead.
soap. You know, we've used this tool with the manufacturers of soap to wash dishes. And they found that one of the big impacts in producing soap to wash dishes was actually palm oil production, again in Malaysia in this case, clearing land to produce, to grow palm trees to raise palm oil, which is used in making the soap.
No, is it
Greg, one question. His Holiness, Your Holiness, you mentioned this factory in Tibet that killed the animals. With this system, what do they make in that factory? Do you know? Do you know that what they make in that factory? Okay,
No
let's
idea.
say they make something to sell to other companies to make something else. With this system, nobody would want anything made in that factory because they killed the animals. In other words, now it would have a consequence for their business, which would make them think, oh, maybe we should operate in a way where we don't kill animals.
Not easy.
No.
마치 그런도 쉬어야
예전에 the Dalai 말에. In I think northeast China, in Manchuria, the Dalai, one factory. I think some I think sometime back since established that, now years has passed. Very recently, the people nearby that factory now begin to notice some illness.
Exactly.
And some sort of I think some damage. So then, only then, the concerned people announce there are some poisonous things there.
toxins. No.
So people,
So then the people protested.
I think about 10,000. 정도에 제가 정도면 제가 지금 말봐. 돈안 제가 말해. I think about 10,000. So that the 돈안이디 이해르체 쉐바 말봐.
So the problem with these kind of situations is that the people who are in charge of the factory knew what kind of chemicals they were using and the toxicities of these products, but they never share it with the local people.
Of course.
And only when the local people notice the impact,
Yeah, that's
then
right.
they,
But
Then they
with this
own-
system, Your Holiness, the people who use the product from that factory would want to ask the factory, report to us how toxic your chemicals are.
This is what 지금 말해.
말해.
그래서 뭐
다들 잘,
Or we
You
won't
cannot
buy.
ask.
다들 잘, 그런 데서 그래. 다들 잘이야.
시험을 주나?
말에 잠불링기 벤조네 단디 콜라지 규소로 찬데 뒤가라 지기 수업의 신다질 총 신다디기 신다질 도체고 뒤가라 다디 딘데게 고유로 지고 태뒤가라
제대로.
아니 뇨년데
많이
깨게
제대로.
지고
제대로.
나래
제대로. 시험을 봐.
나래
그냥 그러시면 좋아.
the only on the that presupposes that they can have the information that they can know.
Well, here's the thing.
So the question is, how do you make it known?
Well, Greg will explain.
That's the difficulties.
There are two things. we
Everything state secret.
can- right.
So very difficult.
Oh, no, but
That's the problem. Now
That's
this is
right.
okay.
That the
Oh.
yes.
So-
Yes.
It's not just that the information is available. The point of this example is that the information is available, but how do you compel a company to make that information
you use
publicly
you use the
available?
power of purchasing from the company. It's not the government that's asking, it's your
So 그냥 information 고
consumers.
This one.
나래,
그냥
나래.
information
customer.
고.
So all of this presupposes that you have the information.
That you have what?
You have the information.
So
Oh, that's what
I'd
Greg
like to
does.
try
Okay.
to address that.
Yeah, this is okay. This is okay.
But that's-
I think more
that's-
political side. The political side.
Actually, that is the Your Holiness. That's the core issue here. So I'll try to address that. There are two ways that we're in an age now of what's called radical transparency. meaning that radically, in a new way, anybody should begin to understand these pictures for every product. Now, there are two kinds of information that we work with in life cycle assessment. One is average information. That's what I'm showing here for the average gold mine in Papua New Guinea and the average production of a battery. And that's the start. So we can find out where in typical production the impacts matter most, and we can ask our company, already retailers, stores are requiring the manufacturers of their products to report these impacts because customers want to know. But you raised also, Your Holiness, a critical question is, how do we know we're getting accurate data from specific sites? This system was built explicitly to address that because it's in the web, meaning people all over the world can report into it, including people in communities living there. So a company should have to report into the system about their actual impacts, but people in communities can go in and say, we live here, here's a photograph of the river.
Not easy. That Tibetan who brought that picture, when he showed me that picture, a lot of fear.
Yeah.
It's true.
So very
That's true.
difficult.
Can be risky.
Oh, yes. difficult.
Can be risky, but Your Holiness, now today, anybody
So
with a-
I think, don't talk about this, those totalitarian sort of regime area. For the time being, we cannot do much.
That's true. That's true.
In the rest of the world, free world, yes, nowadays.
That's true.
Eventually, these countries also, you see, sooner or later, they have to learn these things.
Right.
Exactly.
That's the way.
We heard yesterday that the 1/3 of the carbon footprint from China, so 1/3 of the carbon emissions being released from China are estimated to be associated with production of products purchased in the United States. If that's the case, then the companies in the United States who are selling there and being pressured to provide this information to their consumers are pressuring the supply chains in China and other countries where this data is not yet available, and it's really putting pressure on the producers there. They must report the impacts of their activities.
Because, for example, the biggest company in America is named Walmart. 20% of factories make products for Walmart. Walmart has said, if you don't report this data, we will not buy what you make.
Yeah, good.
Yep.
Yeah, good.
So we're starting to collect more and more information. The other transformation to make much more of this information available is, up until now, these databases have been built by researchers who do surveys. But there's not many researchers in the world, and it takes a lot of time and money to create these databases. But if we require or reward every factory to each report its information into a system that collects it, now we get full information comprehensively and much faster.
So, Greg, you mentioned individually that there's a cost benefit that we can, unfortunately, just by buying anything, there's costs, ecological costs, but that we can do things that are beneficial. Can you give an example of a cost-benefit analysis for the Netherlands power grid? Because I think it's very informative.
Okay. Dan is referring to a study I did. Boy, so when we purchase, we stimulate production all over the earth, which stimulates pollution. But we also saw that when we give money to a company and they give money to companies all over the earth, which where there are workers. And so I did a study to ask how much of the payments that get made to workers that can help raise people out of poverty, what are the human health benefits of those payments, and how do they compare to the human health consequences of the pollution? And I studied, because of the data limitations at the time, now we can do much better, but I used a model that I asked, if we produce electricity in the Netherlands, what are the pollution consequences, the health impacts from those, and where does the money go, and what are the potential lives saved from economic development? We found that most of the pollution occurs in the richer countries because most of the production happens there. But about 10% of the funding in the whole supply chain reached countries which had lower GDP, so they lack clean water, they lack sanitation. And the health, potential health benefits, if the economic development is done well, could be 1,000 times greater than the health costs of the pollution. But that requires that the economic development in the countries that need it most is done in a way which increases incomes of the poor and invests in public infrastructure for sanitation, and clean water, and education. So there again, we need, it shows that, first of all, life cycle assessment, if we only focus on pollution, we're missing potentially something 1,000 times more important, namely the economic development benefits. But it also shows that we have to get detailed data from the location to prove that the activity in those countries is raising incomes of the poor and investing in public infrastructure for education and health. So that's those are some of the benefits.
So in other words, the good news for the poor outweighs the bad news for the wealthy.
It can be 1,000 times greater if it's done right.
주둔지다 야구지가 돈의 제배나 고요돈의 고유 휴견 테스트 그 네베 차용구네 야네 내다 뭐
뭐지 반대하죠.
또 주둔지다 거는 라레도 슬람.
Jonathan, did you have a question?
May I? I was actually just, His Holiness the Karmapa was making some comments, and one thought that came up was the notion that in the present context, part of the reason that so many products from the United States come from China, where we have factories that are quite problematic, as His Holiness pointed out, is that they're cheap.
Right.
And that there's a sort of driving fundamental interest in having low costs and high profits. So that fundamental interest in low costs and high profits drives a certain amount of the manufacturing to places where you can't get this kind of information reliably. So that it seems like part of the problem that's built into the system here is that there's really no appreciation for that fundamental mechanism, that low cost and high profit is just an assumption, a fundamental assumption. And the workers there, or who don't have good benefits, they don't have good salaries and so on, are actually just part of that mechanism. It's
That's
enabling part of that mechanism, and they don't have a choice in that matter.
Right.
So that seems to be, that's not just dependent on China, that's dependent on US companies, for example, and consumers
Right.
who are seeking low-cost, seeking cheap products, and the companies are seeking high profits at low cost. What we end up with then is
Okay.
this situation.
Let me
It
formulate
seems
that
to
as-
be driven by the notion that the cost here, that the cost that you're talking about is not really part of the equation.
So there are really two
question.
sides to the response, and it's good news in two ways, John. First of all, there have been some studies in the last few years which have shown that if you treat workers well, you pay them livable wages, you respect their human rights, you save money. It's actually economically beneficial in the supply chains because the workers are not as sick, they're more productive, they stay with the company longer. So it's actually beneficial economically in many cases to do the necessary thing of respecting human rights and paying livable wages. That's one thing, but there's a second pressure. Dan mentioned Walmart. The large stores of the world right now have a major initiative called the Sustainability Initiative, where they're asking or requiring the major companies that sell to them to report on the environmental and social impacts in the supply chains of those products. And it's true that actually companies have been collecting for years data on working conditions in individual factories. That information has not yet been brought into this kind of analysis, but it's now starting. We know, for example, where the high-risk sectors and countries are for many different worker issues, community impact issues, social issues, we call them. I briefly flashed something called the Social Hotspot Database, which has been compiled by researchers with over 100 different resources, data resources, to give us a first public, it's a freely available portrait of the worker treatment risks and opportunities in global supply chains. And there are companies now, progressive leading companies, are using that tool to help guide data collection to report to customers, including these stores, on how they have to demonstrate that where most of the work is happening, the conditions are good.
But there's another point that His Holiness Karmapa brings up. We make the assumption that it will be more expensive to be environmentally positive. That, in other words, it will cost more to do the right thing. Can you speak to that?
Right, that's, I already, as I said, on the social side, we make that assumption perhaps on the social side more.
What about
we as consumers might make the assumption that we have to pay more for green, but companies have known for a long time, I don't want to overemphasize Walmart, but that's one more time we'll mention them, they love to save money in their supply chains. That's what they're all about, is low cost. Therefore, the vice president for strategy there was using these kind of tools to identify major costs, and they've studied and seen that there's a positive correlation between environmental performance and lower cost, or you could say eco-efficiency and economic efficiency. They correlate many times because much of the pollution is associated with energy or waste, and those cost. So doing things smarter, as it probably in the case of this company in Sweden, often actually saves money. Now sometimes not, so we need to still have this information to put the pressure on the companies to sometimes spend money to reduce the pollution and impacts.
Could I follow up, though?
Sure, and then Jonathan.
I hear an implicit other question
Sure, please.
in what His Holiness the Karmapa said, which is, it sounds like the only value here is profit and cost.
Yes.
That's what it seems like that's all we're talking about. And I'm just wondering whether part of the equation is the notion that there's a value besides how much something costs to produce and how much you can sell it for. And that's part of that's what I'm curious about, whether there's any movement, whether any of this kind of tries to also encourage the notion that there are values beyond simply those traditional economic perspective,
I could
which is
speak
being
to that.
brought in by this type of analysis.
Greg, I could speak to that. There's a debate in business, which is an ethical debate, and there are people who argue ethically it's their responsibility to their shareholders to keep costs down. It's only money that counts. There's another school that says, no, we have a responsibility to everybody we affect, to communities, to customers, and people who work in factories and so on. This is called social responsibility. There's now more movement from the cost alone toward the social responsibility view, toward a broader view of ethics. More money, for example, that's being invested in companies is being guided by, is this company socially responsible or not? And there's evidence that socially responsible companies actually do better in the long run than the other companies. The long-term view pays. Jonathan, you've been waiting for a long time.
Just two comments. One is we have made advances in the safety of workers, and there are requirements internationally. There's something called the worker right to know, where workers have a legal right to know the materials they're working with. Now, oftentimes it may be published in the wrong language, or there may be other problems, but there are some legal instruments internationally to protect workers. There's also something required, the material safety data sheet that all companies need to list out their chemicals. That was one point. But the other thing I wanted to mention, getting back to the trade-off issues and how much harm versus good, there was a recent analysis by two economists published just 3 weeks ago, Bill Nordhaus and Bob Mendelsohn from Yale University. And they looked at cost and benefits of electricity. And we all benefit from electricity, running the computer, running the lights, running the air conditioning. Electricity is very valuable for our development. But they looked at the way electricity is generated, and their analysis, this is a global analysis, was that if electricity is generated from coal, that the cost, the environmental and health cost of burning coal it outweighs the benefit from the electricity, and that's a lot of electricity and a lot of benefits, huge benefits from all that electric power. But in this analysis, if the power comes from coal rather than other sources, it does more harm than good.
Diana?
Exactly, in China, is that problem. Yeah.
And that's the problem in China.
Greg, I wanted to ask you about a couple of contradictions that I think are interesting in terms of what you talked about. The first is that in many countries, people who wish to reduce their environmental impact of their consumption are trying to buy local rather than to buy products that are imported from other parts of the world. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could talk about that, whether asking consumers to buy everything from local companies is better than asking them to buy from all over the world. Mm-hmm. And the second contradiction is the difference between industry and corporations becoming aware of their environmental impact and individuals needing to know the impact of everything they buy. Mm-hmm. Because I know from the experiments in carbon labeling that it's very confusing to a consumer. Mm-hmm. It's bad enough trying to look at the calories and the sugar in everything you buy. If you've also got to look at all the environmental impacts on the label, it will take us months to do our shopping.
Right.
And so the question I have here is, do we really need every individual consumer to know this? Right. Or do we maybe just need for the companies to know it and a few environmental activists who can show them up if they don't behave? So that's two contradictions.
Great. Great questions. I'll start with your first. Consumers, every person, we have limited time. So we need simple rules and information to make decisions. And for a while, we used this idea of buy local because we think, if I buy vegetables locally, they won't be transported and the transportation could have big impacts. But unfortunately, reality is complicated. And it is actually better sometimes, I'll give some examples, to purchase products from far away. Here's what drives it. If the products have been flown, like soft fruits, strawberries, asparagus as a perishable vegetable, if they're products which need to get from farm to store quickly, then they've probably come sometimes by airplane, and it's terrible. The footprint, the impacts of buying those is very large. But if it's a product like a potato or an apple, which can travel more slowly because it doesn't become spoiled quickly, then it's been brought to you by truck or rail or boat. Sometimes apples come on boats amazingly from New Zealand halfway around the world to the United States. And that the transportation impacts, even of coming all the way around the world on a boat, are usually small compared to the impacts on the farm. Which brings me to the next point. If the farm is very efficient because it's the right place to grow potatoes, there are certain parts of the world where potatoes naturally grow. Then the fertilizer inputs, the water inputs, the energy required to grow those potatoes in those locations like Idaho in the United States are very low. The potatoes grow without effort. But in Massachusetts, closer to where I live, you have to put a lot of things in to grow the potatoes. So somebody in Massachusetts will have a smaller impact by buying a potato from Idaho. So it really depends. Now, does that mean that we all need to have our iPhones and use, spend a week in the store to find out? No, I think that's a really key question. My vision for this is that consumers at best need extremely simple information in a few forms. One could be that a store can guarantee to the consumers that everything bought there is maybe one way is as green as possible, but I like to think they could actually guarantee that the products have a net benefit to the environment. That's simple. Consumers, if we know that the products sold in this store have a net benefit, we don't have to work with numbers. But it does put a lot of pressure and market force on the companies to get the numbers and to demonstrate that it's net positive. Sure. Pardon? Chocolate. I mean, let's just... We've seen that chocolate, if it requires milk, has dairy in it and so on. I mean, any product has negative impacts, but we were talking at the break, was talking with Barry about how reforestation in Haiti, for example, could have huge benefits. So if we put pressure on a company to understand its impacts and then invest in benefits which offset those impacts, that's one way. Another could be that the producer of the product redesigns the product so that over the life cycle, it has a net benefit. I mentioned Caterpillar, which makes bulldozers. Imagine this. A bulldozer is, of course, made out of huge amounts of steel and the engine and so on. But Caterpillar uses life cycle assessment. And they found that the impacts of operating the bulldozer are around 90% of the total impacts. They're 10 times greater than the impacts of making the bulldozer with all that steel and energy. So they redesigned the bulldozer to be more efficient. And I think that the net effect of that redesign was, over the lifetime of the bulldozer, is more savings than all the pollution required to make it. So that we don't buy bulldozers in stores, but any company can innovate by looking at its life cycle and reducing the things that matter most.
Yes.
I have a good story about chocolate. There's a company that most of you know, Mars, who makes the chocolate Mars. But they also do a lot of things like coffee, Uncle Ben rice. It happens it's a family company. They don't depend upon the stock market, so they can do more or less what they want. They are $45 billion. And one of the heir, who is not the CEO, is a Buddhist practitioner. So 5 years ago, he decided to have a full-time team of economists to design what he called the triple bottom line. Reduce the profit, but improve the quality of life in all the sectors, from the people who work within Mars to the people who extract the cocoa in, I forgot where,
Ghana, yeah.
Ghana and somewhere, and to the environment. So to go from 15% to 7% profit, but have those triple bottom lines satisfied. And they are working very well. There's even Stiglitz, with a Nobel Prize Economy, just advising them. And they want to try now, from next year, that model on all their coffee chain and see how it works. And they are confident it might work. So that might be a very good example, because they have the capacity to do that, as they don't depend upon the ups and downs of the market, and they have the vision to do that. So that brings me to one small remark about you had footprint, handprint, and I want to add mindprints. So Mindprints is the motivation, the vision. Those guys were visionaries. So they say, we have to reduce our profit to have a quality of life and environment. It takes a lot of mindprint to do that. And ideas, as Sally often also says, ideas have power. And in terms of the individual, there's a Buddhist saying that if you are content, it's like having a treasure in the palm of your hand. If you recite 10 times the mantra, I need nothing in the morning, you are less likely to be high consumer. So mindprint is, of course, at the root of all of handprint, which then can reduce our footprints. So let's change our mind to better transform the world.
Thank you, Matthew.
It seems now very complicated discussion. So finally, the concept of socialism and capitalism. So right from the beginning, as far as the socio-economy theory is concerned, I am Marxist. So many these sort of problems. I think too much concentrate profit, lack of holistic, and too much greed. Not thinking the concern of the well-being of the society.
Absolutely.
So that's the American imperialist, the capitalist mistake. But
I'm sorry.
Then on the other hand, the Soviet socialists also fail. The communists today now, China, the capitalist communist, capitalist socialist.
Good point.
More confusion.
But
more confusion.
Your Holiness, what's the ecological implications of Marxism? Have Marxist countries have better ecological records?
No.
Oh,
No.
Sally?
Again, these socialist countries, I think former Soviet socialist country, I don't think genuine socialist country,
Right, exactly.
just controlled by communist. Their interest is power, nothing else. They don't care about the public health or these things. So a lot of pollutions, a lot of sort of negative things there.
But if you look at, I'm sorry.
Sally, please.
Yes, I want to follow up a little bit on what Matthew said about vision. That is, it depends in part on what vision we have for our economics. We don't have to have the same kind of economics. People mention economics and they think there's only one kind. Economics that we have, market capitalism, is a model. It's one interpretation. But if we had an ecological economics, which puts more emphasis on just distribution and sustainability, rather than on a single individual, as in market capitalism, that can get all that they can hoard. I mean, now it's built upon the individuals who have the most power to get the most resources. But what if we had a different vision of economics, in which we start not with the individual hoarder, the insatiable individual from Adam Smith, but we start with the other two factors, just distribution, so that all the different interests get enough basic food. All the life forms that are part of the system get the basic essentials. And we look at the sustainability of the whole, and those become our economic goals. then instead of working within, what we're doing now is figuring out the footprint within one system of economics. But I think the Wall Street protests, which many of us have been talking about, are questioning something deeper and more basic. And that is, there's something wrong with the system. There's something wrong with the way that we're putting our economics together.
그 시스템부터는 견주지 라기여버지 문제 지기요 레스탄데 뭐 고치니 되게 대단 아주 망부지 그 에코노믹스 랍도가 도단지란 지금도 매배소리 따대.
I think ultimately, as you mentioned, the motivation or sense of sort of because of the responsibility, sense of concern of others' well-being, that's the key thing.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you see, no matter what sort of good system will not be good. System may be very good, but the person who implement the system, something lacking here, then everything spoiled.
To build
I
on-
think we Buddhist, Buddhist system, I think excellent, but those people, including myself, not properly implement, then there's no guarantee just to say, oh, system is good. We become rubbish. So any system, ultimately, whether it's because of that beneficial,
beneficial or
not,
harmful.
harmful, ultimately related here. Sense of responsibility and altruistic sense of concern of others' well-being. Others' well-being are majority. That's more important than my own interest. That's the key factor. That cannot be produced by computer. I think these great brain scientists eventually, I think, remove bad part of our brain and put one or something because of the brain of robot there. So then not much feeling. That also I think negative.
Your Holiness, I agree with what you're saying. I remember yesterday you talked about Bhutan and Estonia as being different visions of how we might live. It isn't that one system that can solve the problem. It's that if we live within a vision that is a lie, that is different than the way, I mean, what we have learning from the sciences is that everything is interdependent and interrelated.
Yes.
But that's not the way market capitalism works. It works by the individual going by themselves alone and not worrying about solidarity with the others. So if we have a different, let's call it a vision instead of a system, we have a different vision like Bhutan, then we have the possibility of individuals deepening their awareness and rising to the challenge and being dedicated the way that you have talked about, so that they're not, it's helpful, the whole vision helps them be better, right? Whereas market capitalism makes people worse. They become more and more jealous and selfish.
Very, very concerned of me, like that. That's difficult. Actually, we are social animal. Whether we like it or not. That's the basic nature of a human being. So oneself, because the individual's interest actually entirely depend on the well-being of the society. Now today, whole nearly 7 billion humanity, that's the basis of our future. Whether economy field, or religious field, or political field, everywhere. I think that sense of sort of responsibility is the key factor. This is my feeling. Or one time, you say, I met one Indian official, or parliament member, Indian parliament member, in a poor sort of state. When my flight from that state to Delhi, so while we waiting at the airport, I met, that person as a parliament member. So I sort of expressed, there are so many poor people. And Kasadi means just in the tribes.
The tribal areas.
Tribal area. I just expressed. Then he told me, yes, there are sort of kasore, the system sort of the kasoda sanek or sanek ngati rimba the jig urang the shung rimba ne, the tato cheaki, corporate rotan didi, shida yao yaresa.
So the parliamentarian responded, actually, this is a problem that has been recognized, and the government at various levels, state, provincial, and at the federal level, various programs put in place to respond to these needs. So there is a lot of wonderful programs that are institutionally placed.
Then he mentioned, because person who on the spot suppose implementing these things are not caring properly. Just try to find opportunity to
make money.
get more money. That's all. So again, ultimately, individual person sort of the moral sort of ethics, sense of responsibility.
Your Holiness, your teachings have taught me and millions of others that compassion, being compassionate for others and caring about their well-being is a source of happiness to ourselves. And you also teach that contentment is very rarely, once we meet our basic needs, it's rarely associated with more material possessions. So income, as you often teach us, is poorly correlated with happiness, with well-being. It seems practical now to me for the first time, with some of the tools that we've talked about and others, to show people, first of all, the ways that their actions are impacting the world, to wake up the compassion to say, I'd like to make I see that I'm having an impact, and I'm aware now, so I want to make it better. We can also, there are ways to track our own well-being over time as a function of the things we're doing. There's a website where you can choose to, for example, start meditating and then track your happiness and your heart rate, your blood pressure over time, and see if it's getting better. And when we make this kind of information public to people, and we see, hey, he just reduced his income, reduced his spending, and he's happier, I want to be happier too. I mean, I think by making, by enhancing our awareness, I mean, Buddhism says that this is science, this is truth. We just need to help people see it. I wonder if those are pieces of the solution.
Elka or Claire? Claire, did you have a...
My questions, kind of the conversation has moved on a bit. But I was going to ask Greg, he seems to be this whole process relies a lot on market forces. And there doesn't seem to be a role for regulation. But given the ways in which people are corrupt and businesses may not want to pursue these kinds of practices, do you think that there actually is a role for regulating some of these kinds of emissions and other sorts of impacts?
Chimdone talamde yonas tanda kurang se some market forces janjal rely che kunyen shake to us company tikiti ya ko lo jon du ros ta chitim gutone chit tapshe yonas.
I think so. I'm very depressed or disappointed by the progress over the last 10 years in the United States and in Western countries, most Western countries at the national level, to regulate sufficiently to address climate change. It's not the only issue, but if we look at climate change as an example, regulations are fought often by very powerful economic interests, and we don't get effective regulation. Whereas consumers and purchasing is a language that is already being spoken to the companies every day. So I think regulating working conditions, regulating on environmental pollution, clearly there's a need to push as hard as we can on those, but I guess I feel that we have to do more through voluntary mechanisms to get the results we need as fast as we need.
But
And you know, people aren't suggesting that voluntary mechanisms or consumer pressure is the only solution, but I think we've learned that regulation is not sufficient either.
there was, I think, implicit in what Claire said, something, an interesting question, which is what would keep this system, what would keep its integrity? How would you keep it from being corrupted? How can we trust this system? I think you were alluding to that.
Okay. Well, validation of the data, I mean, we're getting to we're proposing a new realm where every producer is reporting on their impacts. It needs to be verified locally to avoid cheating.
You mean independently verified? By someone who doesn't work for the company?
That's right. But you know, His Holiness again was saying that the heart of the implementer is what matters. If you could have great programs, but if the implementer's heart is not in the right place, we won't solve this. Remember, it's only people that work in these companies. And most people, I've never met anyone who wants to pollute. And one company that I'm starting to work with, they're the 7th largest employer on earth. They have programs where employees are encouraged to reduce their impacts at home, but encouraged to reduce the impacts of the business at work. And so I think, again, it comes back to if we can find ways to really make it clear to people that their actions at home and work are ultimately the only thing that's causing these impacts and the final piece of the solution, then I think the hearts of the implementers will be on track and the progress can be very deep and rapid.
Observation that might connect to this as well, because we're actually been talking about the sort of production end and the responsibility of business persons, but there's also an issue on the consumer end, which is how I will convey what comment he was making, and that is that, you know, even you can just see this sort of on the way in Dharamsala. If you go on the various roads, you might see vegetable stands or other shops selling biscuits and so on, and yet right next to a very busy road with particulate pollution coming out of various vehicles and so on. On the one hand, what we have then is a very dirty environment, a polluted environment, and yet that's where we do our shopping. Well, one reason for that is it's convenient. And so there's also a certain sense in which part of the issue that's driving the problem here is also on the consumer end, that we seek things like convenience and ease and low price to bring up the other issue. Is that also part of the problem here in terms of, I mean, are consumers sincerely generating the interest in actually having this type of information? How successful can that be in this context? In other words, are consumers actually interested in this information, or do they also need, in a sense, a certain change of heart in order to start to participate in this way?
I have some data that speaks directly to that. There are market surveys asking shoppers, do you really care about how sustainable your products are? In the West, about 10% say, yes, I care a lot. 33% say, no, I don't care at all. The people in the middle, 60% or so, say, if it were easy, if it were convenient, I would make the better decision. Now, that's true for current generations of shoppers. If you ask people who are very young, it changes. Young people have grown up with a constant stream of bad news about their own future because of the climate and so on. So their motivation as shoppers is higher to pay attention. So companies are looking at this data and they're thinking, well, our long-term strategy should be this. That's why these big companies are interested in finding out this information, because they want, in the history of business in America, no company has survived more than 100 years, maybe one or two. So companies know that just like human beings, they live and die. And so they're looking ahead to be positioned to survive. So it's not just the consumer who counts, it's the person, he's called a brand manager. The brand manager is the person in the company who makes the product. What we need to do is get the attention of brand managers, because they're making the decisions to implement the kinds of things that Greg is doing.
I think basically, of course, my knowledge is very limited, but it seems, you see, I think a human way of thinking, I think becoming more and more realistic. Now these are, I usually call realistic approach. Even for our own interest, individual interest, we must sort of follow more realistic. So I think the awareness, I think the result of all these experts sort of work as well. So they're getting more sort of convincing information, awareness. Then others, again, ultimately, for one's own selfish reason, you have to take care of the rest of the your community. And then furthermore, today's global economy, sort of ecology, and all many other factors. Whole group is just one entity. So awareness through information, through education, I think led by not a politician, not leader, but I feel again the scientist, a real guru. So more awareness, and this is the technology use maximum way to get better, because of more, because of wider
dissemination.
So that's the only way. So it seems now, I always telling, within 20th century, the humanities way of thinking and approach, early part of 20th century, later part of 20th century, I think much change. Now I think the global level, concept of war. Early part, no question. Later part of the 20th century, when some violence involve people, always ask, it's necessary like that. When nation declare war, a lot of people express the opposition. So these are, I think, clear indication we humanities, way of thinking, becoming more realistic. And then environment issue. In the early part of the 20th century, I don't think there's much people talking about environment. Even our own scientific meeting, in early part about brain or these things.
Exactly.
Now gradually now talking these things also now, much more.
So also these kind of issues now become more current part of our discussion.
So this is not just because of the express, because of the due to interest few individuals, but you are representing a lot of people's sort of real interest, real concern. So this is, I think, sometimes it is necessary to look the positive side. Otherwise, hearing all negative thing, then you see their loss, you see the enthusiasm. I, just one individual, I cannot do much. Then sometimes you feel better to close your ear and carry daily life. So I often is telling, or my own experience also, sometimes a tragedy happen, sadness, or frustration that must translate into more enthusiasm, more determination. So as a result of our discussions, there are a lot of problems. These problems are not just one individual's problem. No, one nation's problem. This is whole global levels of problem. So it is very serious. So in order to survive and survive happily, we have to carry some sort of sense of responsibility and make effort. There is possibility. Watching the 20th century, much change, not by force, but by awareness. So within the 21st century, I think due to these Guruji's sort of clear sort of prediction, right? Prediction was what way?
Predictions.
Predictions, I think really makes a differences.
Your Holiness, thank you very much. That's a wonderful note to end on, because now that the scientists, the gurus have told us, in the afternoon and from now on, we're shifting from awareness, which we now have a lot of, to action. We'll resume this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.